After the video about the method that I and my editing clients use to write 3 times faster, I had a ton of requests for a more detailed breakdown about the actual process. And y'all, to the folks who were telling me you would watch an hour-long video about this, first of all, I love y'all. And second of all, you might get it. Let me tell you, I have some notes here and it's starting to look like a deep outline. So if this goes on for an hour, then we're going to spend an hour together in the woods. I've got my notes. I've got a cup of decaf coffee because it's going on evening here. The sun is starting to set. So if you have no idea what video I'm talking about, y'all, it is the very first ever episode of The Writing Woods. So you can head on back there and watch that, and it'll give you a little bit of a primer for what we're about to talk about today. If you have already watched that video and are excited to learn about deep outlining, or at least interested in learning about deep outlining, we're going to jump right in. Of course, before we do, we will take a second to take a deep breath because you've made it to the Writing Woods. And y'all, we're talking about a little bit of a process today, a very structured process. And it's a process that I really believe in, or else I wouldn't be sharing it with you. But of course, there is no right or wrong way to write a book. There is what works for you. I do believe in trying everything that we possibly can, because we never know what's going to work for us until we give it a try. With that said, today we are talking about deep outlining, which by my definition is the process of writing a deep 10 to 20,000 word outline before ever beginning drafting. So if you watched that first video, you've already heard about why this works. The short version is that, first of all, it's a lot easier and quicker to address issues in the deep outline than in the actual draft once you've already written the story. And it gives you a really solid idea of where you're going, exactly what you're going to be writing, and all the important stuff behind it, so that once you sit down to write, all you have to think about is writing. You can really get into your story, get mentally and emotionally all the way in it. And in my experience, that makes the writing go faster and it results in a stronger draft. You're not trying to figure things out as you go. You're already prepared and confident before you ever start writing. How do you actually do it? What does this process look like? I'm going to preface this by saying that I am describing my process, and even within this deep outlining method, there are so many different ways you could go about it. So use this as a starting point, but don't be afraid to branch out and try different things. You can really make this process your own. Alrighty, y'all, here we go. I'm going to break this process into 5 stages. So stage 1, we are focused on character. First thing we're going to do is start with a high level outline. More of the traditional outline that you've seen, maybe written for your books. It'll be a page, maybe 2, with bullet points. But really, instead of focusing on the plot at this stage, instead of thinking through the events, really just hone in on the characters, especially your protagonist. Your main focus here is going to be the primary conflict. So goal, obstacle, stakes. What does your protagonist want? What is in the way? And what is at stake if they don't reach their goal? What is the worst case scenario for your protagonist? If you can't answer those questions for your story, keep thinking until you can answer that solidly. And by solidly, I mean that your answers are specific. If it feels vague, or if it takes you a whole paragraph to answer the question, then it might not be nailed down enough. And in a character-driven story, we are building the plot around the characters, not the other way around. So that's why it's so important to start with the characters and be able to answer these questions very, very early on. And once we start talking about the next steps, it'll make sense while we're trying to set this really solid foundation. The whole premise behind this deep outlining method is that we create a strong foundation at every stage. We don't rush on to the next step. We make sure that we have completely built out everything that we need at this stage so that as we start developing our story, it's not going to crumble, right? It's solid. And by spending this extra time in the beginning, We're going to save so much time as we move on because we're not going to see walls fall into the ground and having to rebuild them. We know that when we set something, it's good. And of course, stuff happens. There might be a few bricks out of place that we have to fix, but that's a completely different situation than half of your structure washing down the hill, you know? All right, so again, stage 1, high level outline, hitting the main points. We're thinking about our characters, especially our protagonists, nailing down that main conflict, goal, obstacle, stakes, and then we're thinking about how our protagonist will change and grow throughout the course of the story. What does their arc look like? What flawed worldview does your protagonist have to overcome? And y'all, if you have not read The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr, check that out. Of all the craft books that I've read, that is the one that has had the biggest impact on me. If you're thinking about telling a character-driven story, I think his framework is just indispensable. So he would call this their sacred flaw. It is a belief that is holding your character back or harming them in some way. And most often the character is going to be in denial about this. So maybe your protagonist believes that they don't need anyone, that they can do everything themselves, and that's just easier for them. And throughout the course of the story, the plot is going to test that belief by throwing things at them where they could have used help, or where they do receive help and they find it beneficial. So then they have to choose whether to hold on to that belief system or to reject it, to overcome it. And in that example, the protagonist may face that inner belief that they don't need anyone, because again, they're usually in denial about this, so they may not even know the belief is there, and then potentially overcome it. And by the end of the story, understand that they do need people, they can accept help, and that's okay, and their life is better for it. Of course, there's a version of that story where they do not overcome the belief, the sacred flaw that is harming them, and that would be a different story. But in either case, you do need to identify what that thing is. So at this stage, we are being very, very flexible about the actual events of the story. We are focused on the character's journey. We're understanding their internal world. We're getting to know their history and their belief system. And as we're building out this character arc, then we can kind of think about, all right, what events would test this belief in them? What key events do I need to include? And of course, every story starts with a different seed. You know, you might have just an idea, a premise. You might have a character in your mind. Maybe it's about a setting or a moral theme, or you have one image or one line of dialogue, or just that one sentence that's just echoing around in your mind that you can't let go of. So this process looks a little bit different depending on that seed. You start with what you have, right? Get what you have down on the page. But then once you have the chance to start developing it out into that outline, and you have different directions that you could take it, you have different options for what to think about next, remember to try to hone in on the character. Instead of going crazy thinking about all the events that could happen, try to stay focused first on your character's inner journey. So at this point, you'll have a pretty thin outline that is really just the primary conflict, what your protagonist wants, what's in the way, and what's at stake if they fail, their inner belief system, the flawed worldview that is holding them back. And this can and will be refined later in the process. It's not uncommon for a lot of this to change, and if not change, deepen. Because as you get into this, you're getting so much deeper than surface level. As you introduce more elements, you're learning more about your character, and things can change. And that's why we do it like this, so that as things change, you have as little material as possible to adapt. Even doing this high-level outline before you start trying to flesh out the events minimizes the adjustments that you'll need to make on your deep outline. So it's kind of a nested process. We're making an outline for our outline. And I'm not going to sell you on this because I already made a video doing that. And if you're here, I assume that you agree with the premise that doing this work up front is going to save us time in the long run and help us write a better story. But I do recognize sometimes, especially as I'm talking about it like this, that it sounds like a lot. It sounds a little bit extra. And I did not used to do this. For reference, I am definitely that person who likes spreadsheets and goes just a little bit nuts with organization. But throughout my writing journey, I have grown, as a lot of writers do, from a pantser where I planned and outlined nothing and I wrote by my heart and my gut and the light of the moon. But over time, of course, that didn't work out as well as it could have for me. So I started outlining, and then I had an experience where I lost basically an entire manuscript, all that work, because I didn't bring my agent in early. So y'all remember that you can bring in your agent and your editor on your deep outline. I do professional edits on clients' deep outlines, and it is fantastic. It saves them time and money and helps them write more and better stuff. So I said I wasn't going to sell you on it, but here I am. I don't know. I get excited, y'all. It's okay. Moving on to stage 2. Now we have our regular outline, which is very character focused. We're going to start deepening that out into our deep outline. And at this point, we're going to switch focus a little bit to the plot. So we understand the conflict and we see our character arc in a very broad way. Now we're going to work on developing the plot around that arc. So your protagonist has a flawed worldview that is harming them in some way. Think about how your plot can test that belief. That's going to create a lot of conflict in your story, and that is going to force your protagonist to either change or dig in their heels. But either way, they are forced to make a decision. Now, you might have some external conflict going on here too, but really honing in on that internal conflict, building the story around it, and letting the external develop naturally, in my experience, is going to help create that character-driven story that feels deep and important and like more than just a series of events, if you know what I mean. You know, sometimes you read a book and you finish and you feel like you just played a hand of rummy. You know, a lot of stuff happened, but none of it really mattered. And then sometimes you finish a book and it feels like the world just shifted. Like everything you just read and experienced was so important. It feels like something must have changed in the real world. You know, it must have impacted reality somehow because it was that deep. I don't know about y'all, but that's the kind of story that I want to write. And that's the kind of story I try to help my clients write. And it comes from developing these characters who are so real and so raw, and all of their actions stem from their inner world. They're not doing things just because it makes sense for the plot. You know, they're doing things because they have fears and goals and flaws, and they see the world a certain way, and that's how they interact with it. So, as we're developing this plot, we're thinking about our characters' inner world, about their sacred flaw, the belief system that is somehow harming them, and we're thinking about what events can we have happen that would press on that wound. We want to make them squirm, right? We want to make them have to either look at it or turn away from it. They can no longer just be comfortable with this perspective. We're going to test it. So slowly developing this outline, just building it out like clay. As we're doing this, we're also thinking about cause and effect and putting this puzzle together. Building a story really is like working a puzzle. You just start with what you have, build off of it. Think about, if this happens, then what would be natural? Follow that line of thought as far as it goes. And then if that doesn't work out, if that doesn't get you where you want to go, then kind of like hiking, you get off trail, you go back to the last known point. So return to the last known point and then start building in a different direction. Even as you're doing this, try not to get too locked in. Try to spot elements or plot points that could box you in later. Just keep an eye out. And remember to note the setting and the general timeline, even if it's just the seasons. Honestly, I am so bad about this. I always forget to note the months or the seasons, and I always need that information. So don't be like me. Make note of the timeline. So at this point, we've got a deepened outline. We may be looking at 5 or 6 pages here. We have the events of the story laid out in kind of a broad overview. This is just a bird's eye view of the story. We have our character's arc laid out. We understand the basics of at least our protagonists. We understand the primary conflict of the story, goal, obstacle, stakes, and we have the key events of the story kind of plotted out. I'll note here that while I usually do this in just a regular outline, you could do, whatever you want. You could use index cards, Post-it notes, a whiteboard, sidewalk chalk, whatever you want to do. Sky's the limit here. All right, stage 3. Now that you've got the overall plot, it's time to start working on the structure. So you're going to make some big decisions here about how you want to present this story. I have a whole video about the structural elements to think about, and I suggest you really think about them rather than just relying on what you've always done or what feels like the default. Some of the high points, the order of the scenes. Are you going to order them chronologically, or are you going to do something like flashbacks? How many POVs? One single POV protagonist, or multiple POVs, dual POVs, where they go back and forth with each chapter from a different character's perspective? Whose story is this? Are you going to write in first person or third person, limited or omniscient? How close is your POV going to be? Is the narrator the same as the POV character, or are they a separate entity? Is your narrator going to be reliable? I really like thinking about these things at this stage. All right, y'all, the sun is getting to be in my face, so I think I'm going to take this party elsewhere, as in like 10 feet away. All right, y'all, thanks for coming along with me. The sun was shining right in my face, so this is better for me. Making these structural decisions early can really save you some headaches as you get into it, and especially because if you're anything like me, a lot of the time I just didn't even think about this stuff. I just did what I've always done. For example, I've always written in third person. I didn't think of it as a decision I even needed to make. That was just what I did. And so when I realized, oh no, I should have written this in first person, I had to go back and rewrite a lot of material. So actually giving these questions the time and attention that they deserve can save you some time and headaches. And it can help you make sure you're doing what's best for the individual story. So after we have made those big key decisions, and it's okay if you make those kind of soft decisions and see where it goes, but just keep it in the back of your mind. We're going to start building out our story scene by scene with a focus on structure. So stage 1 focus was character, stage 2 was plot, and stage 3 is structure. You have your key events. Now we're going to start developing scene by scene, chapter by chapter, and scene by scene. Personally, this is a bit of a personal thing, but I like to kind of ignore chapters for the most part as I start. I kind of dump them into chapters, but loosely. My chapter breaks always get changed. And also, as you're doing this, as you're using this process, you will get better at estimating how long your scenes are going to turn out. I know the first deep outline I did, I was so incredibly off with my estimates of how long each scene would be. And now I can get it pretty dialed in. For the most part, I can tell this is going to be a pretty beefy scene, or this one's just a drive-by, you know? So you're taking your overview of the plot and you're breaking it out into scenes, filling in those gaps between key events and just fleshing out your story. We're thinking about how much page space we're dedicating to different elements, different POVs or subplots or any structural element. And we have an eye on the structural high-level pacing. So how is this story moving? At this point, we're also going to be thinking about transitions between the scenes, making sure that we are leaving questions open to be answered, giving the reader reasons to keep reading. So what this is going to look like is writing at least a paragraph for each scene. Some may be shorter or longer. If you have scenes that have much less content than the others, that usually means either one, you didn't spend long enough thinking about it, or two, that scene could actually be combined with another one. I find a lot of the time that my scene content, as I'm doing this, will start slimming down as I get near the end of the story. Say most of my scenes have about 3 paragraphs. My last few scenes may have a short paragraph each. And the reason for it is I start getting antsy. You know, I'm getting near the end of the outlining process and I'm ready to write. And without fail, I have always regretted not going back in and fleshing those out. So take your time here. Remember how much easier you are making things on your future writer self by doing this. We're doing it for a reason. And even when we start getting antsy, just take a breath, trust the process. A little more about what this specifically might look like. So I'm saying write a paragraph for each scene, which is pretty vague, I realize. Specifically what this looks like for me. I write in Scrivener, and when I'm writing, I have my project set up where each folder is a chapter and then each file within the folder is a scene. So as I'm going through and breaking out my outline into scenes, I just go ahead and put each one in separate Scrivener files in the same layout that my manuscript will be written. It's easier for me, and in my Scrivener I have compile settings specifically for my outline. So when I get ready to compile my outline and send it to my agent, I will use my outline settings and just compile it into one document for her. So for each scene, I'm writing down anything that I think is important. So I'm writing down what actually happens, the setting, hopefully at least the time of year. I always forget that and I always regret it. I'm writing down the conflict for that scene. What does each character want? What are their goals, obstacles, and what's at stake? I'm making note of how this scene ties in with the primary conflict. What is happening externally, but also how do the characters feel about it? What's their emotional response? What's their inner world look like? For a lot of scenes, I am also writing out snippets. I'll do a lot of dialogue snippets that just kind of looks like a script, just literally writing out what the characters are saying. Sometimes I'll write out internal dialogue of a sort, so kind of imagine that the protagonist is telling me the story. And doing that helps me get at their inner conflict and their inner world. And a lot of time this is more than a paragraph. I'm saying at least a paragraph. Especially for my really climactic scenes, this can run pretty long. I will throw maps in there. I wrote a story set on the Appalachian Trail and I had maps all over that outline. And for that one, I was actually noting what mileage they were at each specific scene. So that was added into my outline. At every chapter, at least, I had the mileage. So what exactly you will include does heavily depend on the context of your story. It's not going to be the same for every writer or every manuscript. But when it's done, it basically looks like a heavily structured brain dump. You've kind of taken everything that you're thinking and feeling and might want to include and just made sure you have access to it. And I don't use all the content that I write during my deep outlining process, but I use quite a bit of it. And stuff that doesn't get used directly usually inspires something. I really do think of this as kind of notes to my future writer self. What am I going to need to be reminded of when I am actually writing this scene? And sometimes you really do get called to write those scene snippets, you know? Sometimes you get into this and you're in writer mode, you're seeing that scene so clearly, and you just need to get some of it out. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I love doing that, and it's almost a present to myself when I get to actually write that chapter for real and I have, 500 words written. So I imagine you're kind of seeing how this can very easily turn into that 10 to 20,000 words, because it is an outline, but it is more than an outline too. Now don't skip this one, y'all. I know you're gonna want to. This is your friendly neighborhood editor telling you, don't skip this step. Don't do all of this work and then skip over stage 4. Don't ask me how I know. So what we're going to do here is we are going to actually revise our outline. We're going to treat this like a first draft, okay? Think of your outline like the first draft of your manuscript. At this point, it is fleshed out enough that you can actually revise it. So we're going to do this for real, okay? We're not going to run over this and just give it a looky-loo and move on. We're going to treat this like a real revision. So that means we're going to let it rest. We're going to put it in the drawer, put it out of our mind. I know it is so hard because you're excited too, right? Like you've been working on this, you've been working on the outline, and you're ready to write. We're going to put it away though, because we want to look at it with fresh eyes. So once you feel like it's rested long enough that you can be objective, that's the key, being objective, then we're going to take it back out and we're going to go over it, treating it like a first draft. Look for plot holes, look for areas to improve or to deepen. Think about your character motivations, your cause and effect. Does everything make sense? Are you telling the story you wanted to tell? Look at the pacing. Do you see anything that's going to be slow? Anything that's moving too fast that you might need to add some scenes? Because y'all, anything that you can fix right now is going to save you so much time. Yes, we have fleshed it out to 10 or even 20,000 words. Yes, there's quite a bit to look at, but it is still less than an 80,000 word manuscript. And right now, in this form, it is easier to see. We still have that bird's eye view. So I promise you're going to spot stuff. If you do this, you are going to notice things that you can fix and change, and it's going to feel like a real little change when you just swap a couple scenes around. But think about if you had to do that on your completed first draft of your manuscript. Swapping a couple scenes around in a written manuscript is a much bigger deal, because all of a sudden we have to go back and rewrite, because when the context is different, it bleeds into the story. But that doesn't happen with the outline. Instead of having to rewrite entire chapters, all you have to do is drag and drop a couple files and you're done. So like I say, this is your friendly neighborhood editor telling you, don't skip this step. Revise your deep outline. And for bonus points, send it to your agent or your editor. All right, I am ready and waiting. Send it my way and I will do a developmental edit on your deep outline. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to save you so much time and energy and money, and it's going to result in a stronger story. This is such a cheat code, y'all. I hate the idea of hacks. I really do. But this is one. And it seems counterintuitive. It feels so crazy to be dumping that amount of time and energy into an outline. But it absolutely works, y'all. All right, so you've revised your outline. You have perhaps sent it to your agent, editor, and or betas. You have made any adjustments that you're going to make based on their feedback. Now it's time for stage 5. Do you know what stage 5 is? It's the best stage. It's my favorite stage. It's the reason that I did all of these other 4 stages, developing an outline for my outline and then revising my outline. We did all of this work so that now we get to write, and it's beautiful, and you know exactly what you're doing, and you have a plan, and you can get into that wonderful flow state where you are not thinking about anything except your story, and you are so deep in your story in the moment because you're not having to plan, you're not having to think about how this scene is going to impact the next scene and where you're going to go from here, and doing all those mental gymnastics that you have to do when you're dealing with plot and structure. All you have to think about is getting in to the mind of your characters, of your narrator, getting into the voice of your story until you just feel it, and it's a beautiful thing. So I'll tell you logistically what this looks like for me, because again, I write in Scrivener. So I told you that when I'm doing my deep outline, I set up my Scrivener project like I would for my manuscript, and I put my notes for each scene in an individual file. So when I'm writing, all I do is I pull up my Scrivener project and I just basically write over my outline. I usually just bump my notes down a couple lines, and as I'm writing the actual scene, I just delete those relevant parts from my outline. You could also in Scrivener put the outline in the summary, the little bit on the index cards. I've done that and it's okay, but I don't like the way it exports. So when I go to compile my outline, it didn't come out as pretty and it took a little more work. For me, this was just simpler. Again, there are so many different ways you could do this. That's what works for me. And just finding what works for you is important. Just minimizing resistance with this, I think, is the thing to shoot for. So you're writing, it's going great. You're writing over your outline if you are like me, or you could leave your outline intact. The other thing that I will say here is if you change something while you're writing and it impacts the trajectory of your story, stop and update your outline. Stop and adjust for the chapters you haven't written yet. Again, don't ask me how I know. You're gonna think, oh, I don't need to stop and update my whole outline. I know I changed that. I'll just adjust as I go. And for me, anyway, it is so much more of a headache to try to do that than it would be to stop, take an hour, and fix the doggone outline. Again, you put all this work into creating a deep outline that is going to simplify your writing process. It's going to make it more efficient and allow you to focus on the writing. Why not take an hour and adjust it when you change something? It makes sense, but we're writers and what we do doesn't always make sense. And that's okay, but don't be like me. Stop and adjust your outline. Your future writer self will thank you so much. So that is my process of deep outlining. That's how I do it, start to finish, including the things that you can focus on at each stage and some of the practical choices that I make. And of course, there are so many variations of this that you could do. I will be in the comments listening to the ways that y'all do this. If you have tried deep outlining, I would love to hear about your methods. If you do the same as I do, if you do something differently, as there is so much opportunity in this method. And just like I tell y'all not to be locked in, I really try not to be too locked into my methods, because a few years ago, there's no way I would have done this. And now it works beautifully. And who knows what new methods I'm gonna have cooked up 5 years from now, or learned from other writers like y'all. So truly thank y'all for all of your interest in this method, for the absolutely kind comments that you left. It makes me feel so good to know that it makes me feel so good to share this information and feel that it's going to help other riders. Truly, the riding community is so special in the level of support that we all have for one another. So I just want to thank y'all, and I really hope that you got something from this video, whether it's the full method or just a piece of it that you can incorporate into your process. Well, the sun's getting low and I don't have my hammock with me, so I think it's about time to head out of the woods, but I'll be back and I hope you'll join me.